In the quiet stillness of her bedroom, Emma stood before the antique mirror, her reflection a blur as she dabbed at her eyes, the remnants of yesterday's makeup smudging under her fingertips. Her eyes, once vibrant and full of life, were now ringed with dark circles, a stark contrast to the pallor of her skin. The early morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting a soft, warm glow over the room. But it couldn't penetrate the heavy sadness that clung to her like a shroud. "You're not fooling anyone, Em," she murmured to herself, dropping the washcloth into the sink with a sigh. She reached up to touch her wedding band, the metal cold and unforgiving against her skin. It had been a year since Mark's passing, and she hadn't taken it off since the funeral. "You need to move on," the words echoed in her mind. A well-intended mantra from friends and family. But moving on felt like a betrayal, as if she was erasing the love they had shared. She stared into the mirror, her gaze lingering on the empty space next to her reflection, where Mark's image used to stand, his arms wrapped protectively around her waist, his chuckle echoing in her ears. Turning away from the mirror, she shuffled downstairs, her slippers whispering against the wooden floorboards. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a comforting aroma that did little to ease the ache in her chest. The house felt too large, too empty without him, its once warm embrace now suffocating her with memories. She poured herself a cup and took a tentative sip, the heat searing her throat and momentarily distracting her from her thoughts. As she sat at the kitchen table, the silence was broken by the sudden sound of shuffling paper. She jumped, her heart racing. The newspaper lay on the floor, pages fluttering as if a gust of wind had swept through the room. But the windows were closed, and the only breeze was the one she had just made. "It's just the house," she murmured, trying to convince herself. But the feeling of unease grew with each strange occurrence that had been happening since last night, each one more unsettling than the last. The TV changing channels on its own, the lights flickering, the sense of someone watching her from the shadows. "Emma!" a voice called, soft and tender, from the living room. Her heart stopped. It was Mark's voice, unmistakable. She set down her coffee cup, her hand trembling, and walked towards the sound, her bare feet cold against the tile. The room was empty, save for the flickering flame of the candles she had lit for him the night before, their light casting eerie shadows on the wall. "Mark!" she called out, her voice cracking. Silence greeted her, but the candles flickered again, and in the mirror hanging over the mantel, she saw a flicker of movement. Her heart pounded as she approached, her eyes drawn to the reflection of the sofa. And there he was, his form shimmering and indistinct, like a mirage in the desert. Her eyes widened in horror as she watched the spectre lean in closer, his mouth moving in silent words she couldn't hear. She reached out a trembling hand, but her fingers passed through his ghostly form. The room grew cold, the warmth of the candles seemingly leached away by his presence. She could see the terror in her own eyes reflected back at her. This wasn't a sweet, nostalgic memory. This was something darker, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. And then, the image in the mirror grew clearer, and Mark's expression changed from one of love to one of pain and desperation. His eyes met hers, and she could see the plea in them. And in that moment, she realized she was being drawn in, pulled towards the mirror as if by an invisible hand. She tried to resist, but the force was too strong. She was going to be with him again, but not in the way she had hoped. Her screams filled the room as she stumbled backward, the chair she had been standing beside crashing to the ground. She threw her arms out to brace herself against the wall, but her feet slipped on the polished floor, sending her careening towards the mirror. The glass rippled like water as she reached it, and she felt the cold, unyielding pull of the other side. As she was about to make contact, a frigid gust of wind blew out the candles, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, everything was still, the only sound her own ragged breathing. Then, the mirror began to crack, the jagged lines spidering out from her terrified reflection. The coldness grew more intense, seeping into her bones, making her teeth chatter. A hand, cold and clammy, reached through the fissure in the glass, and she knew it was Mark, trying to hold on to her, to keep her with him. She screamed again, her voice bouncing off the walls of the suddenly cavernous room. She didn't know if she wanted to go with him, if she could handle the terror that awaited her on the other side. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt the hand tighten around her wrist, pulling her closer to the gaping maw of the mirror. The world around her grew dimmer, and she could feel the warmth of her living room being replaced by the icy embrace of the beyond. Emma's eyes widened with horror as the mirror swallowed her whole, the last thing she saw being her own reflection, frozen in a silent scream of terror. On the other side, the darkness was complete, and she could hear the echoes of her own cries for help bouncing off the unseen walls of this new, terrifying dimension. She was trapped with him now, forever a part of his haunting world. The house stood silent, a tomb to their lost love, as the shadows grew longer and the candles remained unlit. Only the shattered remnants of the mirror remained, a grim reminder of the Valentine's Day, when Emma's life had been forever changed. The world outside continued to turn, but inside, time had stopped, frozen in the moment when Emma had stepped through the looking glass and into a never-ending nightmare.